My wife said my 17-year-old son was the reason she wanted a divorce. She said it while we were sitting in our marriage counselor's office, a beige room with motivational posters and a white noise machine that hummed in the corner. Dr. Rachel Simmons, licensed family therapist with 14 years of experience according to the certificates on her wall, had just asked Vanessa what she hoped to gain from our sessions. Vanessa folded her hands in her lap, looked directly at Dr. Simmons, and said that she'd come to realize our marriage would never work as long as Ethan lived with us, that my son's presence was a constant reminder that I'd had a whole life before her, that she'd tried for 3 years to make it work, but she was done competing with a teenager for my attention. Dr. Simmons's expression didn't change, but I saw her pen pause over her notepad. I sat there feeling like someone had knocked the air out of my lungs. Vanessa wasn't crying or emotional. She was calm and matter-of-fact, like she was discussing a work project that wasn't meeting expectations. She said if I wanted to save our marriage, Ethan needed to live somewhere else, with his grandparents maybe, or in a dorm somewhere. She didn't care where, as long as it wasn't our house. I looked at my wife and realized I was sitting next to a stranger. I'd been a widower for 6 years when I met Vanessa at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. My first wife, Claire, had died from complications during what should have been a routine surgery when Ethan was 11 years old. One day she went in for a gallbladder removal, and 3 days later I was planning her funeral because of an infection the doctors couldn't control. Ethan and I spent those 6 years building a life from the ruins of our grief. I learned to cook more than just pasta and grilled cheese. Ethan learned to do his own laundry and manage his homework without his mother's organizational skills. We developed routines and inside jokes and a rhythm that worked, even though there was a Claire-shaped hole in everything we did. I never thought I'd date again. The idea of letting someone new into the life Ethan and I had carefully constructed felt impossible. But then, I met Vanessa at that fundraiser, and she was beautiful and successful and charming in a way that made me feel like maybe I could have a future beyond just being Ethan's dad. She was a pharmaceutical sales representative who traveled frequently and lived in a downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows. She seemed fascinated by my stories about single parenting and genuinely interested in meeting Ethan. When I finally introduced them 4 months into our relationship, she brought Ethan a limited edition graphic novel he'd been wanting and asked him about his favorite video games. Ethan liked her. I thought that meant everything would be fine. We dated for 2 years before getting engaged. Vanessa was patient about the pace, understanding that I needed to make sure Ethan was comfortable with every step. When I proposed, Ethan was 15, and he told me he was happy for us, that he wanted me to have someone, that Claire would have wanted me to move on. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside the city. Ethan walked me down the aisle because it felt right to have him beside me as I started this new chapter. Vanessa cried during her vows when she promised to love and support both of us. She said she was gaining not just a husband, but a son, and that she took that responsibility seriously. I believed every word. We honeymooned in Greece for 2 weeks while Ethan stayed with Claire's parents. When we got back, Vanessa moved into the house Claire and I had bought 13 years earlier. The house where Ethan had lived his entire life. The house filled with memories of Claire in every room. I asked Vanessa multiple times if she was sure she wanted to live there, if she'd prefer we sell and buy something new together. She insisted it was fine, that she understood this was Ethan's home, and she wouldn't dream of uprooting him. She said she wanted to honor Claire's memory, not erase it. I thought that showed incredible maturity and compassion. I was wrong about that too. The changes started subtly. Small comments Vanessa would make about Ethan's habits, how he left dishes in the sink overnight, how he stayed up too late on weekends playing games with his friends online, how he spent too much time in his room and not enough with us as a family. I'd remind her that Ethan was 16, and teenagers naturally wanted independence and privacy. Vanessa would nod and say of course she just wanted us to be close, but the comments continued. They got more pointed. She started suggesting that Ethan was disrespectful when he forgot to say thank you or didn't respond enthusiastically enough to her attempts at conversation. She'd point out times when Ethan chose to eat dinner in his room instead of at the table with us, framing it as rejection rather than normal teenage behavior. When I defended Ethan, Vanessa would get quiet and withdrawn. She'd say she was just trying to help, that she cared about Ethan's development and wanted him to grow into a respectful adult. I told myself she meant well, that she was adjusting to being a step-parent and trying to find her role in our family dynamic. I made excuses for observations that should have alarmed me immediately. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Ethan started spending more time at his best friend's house. Leo's family lived 3 blocks away and had known us since Ethan was in kindergarten. Leo's mom, Patricia, had helped me navigate single parenting in those early years after Claire died. She'd been a lifeline when I didn't know how to handle Ethan's grief or my own. When Ethan started going to Leo's house 4 or 5 nights a week after school, I asked him why. He shrugged and said they were working on a project together. I didn't push for details. I should have. Patricia called me one evening about 8 months after Vanessa moved in. She asked if everything was okay at home. I asked why she was asking. She said Ethan had been spending a lot of time at their house and seemed reluctant to go home, that he'd made comments about feeling like he was in the way. My stomach dropped. I asked her what exactly he'd said. Patricia hesitated, then told me Ethan had mentioned that his stepmom seemed happier when he wasn't around, that he felt like he was disrupting my marriage by existing. I told Patricia there must be some misunderstanding, that Vanessa adored Ethan. Patricia said, "Okay, but that I should talk to him." I promised I would. I didn't. I was afraid of what he'd tell me if I asked directly. Instead, I confronted Vanessa. I told her Ethan felt like he was in the way and asked if she'd done or said anything to make him feel unwelcome. Vanessa looked shocked and hurt. She said she'd been nothing but kind to Ethan and she couldn't control how a teenager interpreted her actions. She said Ethan probably resented her for being with his father and was creating problems where none existed. She started crying and said she'd tried so hard to be a good stepmother, but Ethan didn't want her there, that he was the one making things difficult, not her. I found myself comforting her instead of protecting my son. I told her I was sure Ethan would come around, that we just needed to give it more time. Vanessa nodded and wiped her tears and said she hoped so, because she was starting to feel like she'd made a mistake marrying into a family where she'd never truly belong. The guilt hit me like a physical weight. I thought I needed to try harder to integrate Vanessa into our lives, to make her feel valued and important. I thought the problem was my failure to balance my roles as father and husband. I was looking at everything backwards. Vanessa started implementing house rules without consulting me. Ethan had to be home by 9 o'clock on school nights, even though he'd never had a curfew before and had always been responsible about his schedule. Ethan couldn't have friends over unless Vanessa approved them first, which meant his friends stopped coming over because the approval process was humiliating and arbitrary. Ethan had to check with Vanessa before making plans on weekends because we might have family activities scheduled. When I asked Vanessa why these new rules were necessary, she said structure was important for teenagers, that I'd been too permissive as a single parent, and Ethan needed boundaries. She showed me articles about adolescent development and the importance of consistent discipline. The articles made sense in isolation, but something felt wrong about how she was applying them. Ethan never complained to me directly. He just followed the rules with this resigned expression that broke my heart every time I saw it. I told myself he was fine. That structure was probably good for him. That Vanessa knew what she was doing because she'd read all these parenting books and articles. I kept making excuses while my son disappeared into himself. The college application process started when Ethan was 16, during the summer before his senior year. He wanted to apply to schools in Colorado where we lived, places where he could stay close to home and his grandparents and the life he'd built. Vanessa started suggesting schools on the East Coast, elite universities that would look impressive, but were 3 time zones away. She bought him application guides and took him to college fairs without telling me first. She'd come home excited about programs at schools in Massachusetts and New York, and tell me how proud I should be that Ethan was aiming so high. When I asked Ethan privately if he wanted to go to school that far away, he said he didn't know anymore, that Vanessa had explained how limited his opportunities would be if he stayed local, that maybe she was right, and he should consider schools with better reputations. I asked him what he actually wanted, not what Vanessa thought he should want. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he just wanted everyone to be happy. The resignation in his voice made my chest hurt. He was 17 years old and trying to manage the emotional needs of the adults in his life instead of focusing on his own future. I was letting it happen. Vanessa started planning elaborate weekend trips for just the 2 of us, romantic getaways to mountain resorts and spa weekends and wine tasting tours. Every time I suggested including Ethan or planning a family trip instead, Vanessa would say that couple time was important for maintaining our marriage, that Ethan was almost an adult and needed to learn independence, that he'd be fine staying with his grandparents or with Leo's family for a weekend. She'd frame it as me choosing between her and Ethan, and I'd feel trapped. If I said no to the trips, she'd be hurt and withdrawn for days. If I said yes, I'd spend the whole weekend feeling guilty for leaving Ethan behind. Vanessa seemed to know exactly how to manipulate that guilt. She'd cry and say she felt like she came second to my son, that I'd never truly let her into my heart because Claire still occupied too much space there. She'd say she couldn't compete with a ghost and a grieving teenager. The accusations were designed to make me prove my love by excluding Ethan. I can see that now. At the time, I just felt like I was failing everyone. The evening Ethan came home with a black eye, everything crystallized. He walked through the door at 6:30 on a Thursday, with his backpack slung over one shoulder and a bruise blooming purple and blue across his left eye. I was in the kitchen making dinner, and I dropped the knife I was holding when I saw his face. I asked him what happened. He said he got into a fight at school. I asked with who and why. He said it didn't matter and could he just go to his room. Vanessa walked in from the living room and saw Ethan's face. Instead of asking if he was okay, she asked if he'd started the fight. Ethan said no. Vanessa asked if he'd been suspended. Ethan said the principal gave him 3 days of detention. Vanessa's face hardened. She said that fighting was unacceptable and Ethan should be ashamed of himself, that this kind of behavior reflected poorly on our entire family. Ethan's jaw tightened. I could see him struggling not to cry. I told Vanessa that we needed to hear the whole story before passing judgment. She said there was no excuse for violence. Ethan turned and walked upstairs without another word. I heard his door close quietly. Not slam. Close. Like he didn't even have the energy to express anger anymore. I went upstairs and knocked on Ethan's door. He told me to come in. He was sitting on his bed with an ice pack pressed to his eye. I sat down beside him and asked him to tell me what really happened. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said a kid at school had made a comment about my marriage. Something about how his dad knew Vanessa before I married her. About how she'd been dating someone else when we first met. Ethan said he'd told the kid to shut up. The kid had said more things. Cruel things about Vanessa and about me being pathetic. Ethan hit him. I asked Ethan what exactly the kid had said about Vanessa. Ethan wouldn't tell me. Said it didn't matter because it was probably just rumors anyway. But his eyes told me he believed whatever he'd heard. I asked him if he wanted to talk about what was going on at home. If Vanessa had done or said anything to make him uncomfortable. Ethan looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. He said everything was fine. That I seemed happy, and that's what mattered. I told him he mattered more than my happiness. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his face. He thought I'd choose Vanessa over him if it came down to it. The realization felt like drowning. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I noticed how Vanessa's entire demeanor would change when Ethan walked into a room. How she'd sigh or go quiet or find a reason to leave. I noticed how she'd plan dinners for times when Ethan had commitments, then act disappointed when he couldn't join us. I noticed how she'd monopolize conversations when the three of us were together, talking over Ethan whenever he tried to contribute. I noticed how she'd buy things for herself and me, but never for Ethan. How she'd suggest family activities that aligned with her interests and ignore Ethan's. How she'd make comments about how expensive it was to have a teenage boy in the house, as if Ethan's existence was a financial burden I'd chosen to inflict on her. Every interaction I'd previously dismissed as awkward or misunderstood revealed itself as calculated cruelty designed to make my son feel unwanted in his own home. I'd been watching it happen for 3 years and calling it adjustment. I started documenting everything. I bought a small notebook and kept it locked in my desk at work. Every time Vanessa said something cruel or dismissive to Ethan, I wrote it down with the date and exact words. Every time she excluded him from plans or made him feel like an inconvenience, I documented it. After 3 weeks, I had 12 pages of evidence showing a systematic pattern of emotional abuse. I called Patricia and asked if I could come talk to her without Ethan or Leo knowing. She said of course, and invited me over on a Sunday afternoon when the boys were at a movie. I sat in her kitchen drinking coffee and told her everything. How Vanessa had been treating Ethan. How I'd missed it for so long. How guilty I felt for bringing her into our lives. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I knew what I was going to do. I said I was thinking about marriage counseling first. That maybe if Vanessa understood how her behavior was affecting Ethan, she'd be willing to change. Patricia gave me this look that was equal parts sympathetic and skeptical. She said people who systematically abused children didn't usually stop because someone asked them nicely. That Vanessa had shown me exactly who she was, and I needed to believe her. I asked Patricia if Ethan had told her more than she'd shared with me before. She hesitated. Then she said Ethan had confided that Vanessa had told him he was the reason I seemed stressed all the time. That I'd be happier without the burden of a teenage son. That once he left for college, my real life with Vanessa could finally begin. My hands started shaking so badly, I had to put down my coffee cup. I asked Patricia when this had happened. She said multiple times over the past year. Vanessa had been telling my son he was ruining my life. I asked why Ethan never told me. Patricia said he didn't want to ruin my marriage. That he thought I deserved to be happy after losing Claire. That he'd decided the solution was to minimize his presence and eventually leave. My 17-year-old son had been planning to disappear from my life because my wife had convinced him that's what I wanted. I confronted Vanessa that night after Ethan went to bed. I told her I knew she'd been telling Ethan he was a burden, that she'd been systematically trying to push him out of our home. Vanessa's face went pale and then flushed red. She asked who'd told me that. I said it didn't matter. She said Ethan was lying to cause problems between us. I told her I'd talked to Patricia, who'd confirmed multiple conversations. Vanessa said Patricia had always been territorial about her role in Ethan's life and was trying to undermine our marriage. I asked Vanessa to explain her exact words to Ethan about him being the reason I was stressed. She said she'd never said anything like that. I pulled out my phone where I'd typed notes from my conversation with Patricia. I read back the specific phrases Vanessa had allegedly used. Vanessa's expression changed. She stopped denying and started justifying. She said she'd only been trying to help Ethan understand that his behavior affected others, that he needed to learn consideration and emotional intelligence, that everything she'd said came from a place of trying to help him mature. I asked how telling a teenager that his parent would be happier without him was supposed to help him mature. Vanessa started crying. She said I was twisting her words, that she'd been trying to navigate an impossible situation where Ethan resented her and made her feel like an outsider, that I always took his side and never considered how hard it was for her to be a stepmother to a kid who didn't want her there. I told her that Ethan had never made her feel unwelcome, that she'd made herself unwelcome by treating him like an inconvenience from day one. Vanessa's tears stopped abruptly. She looked at me with cold eyes and said, if I couldn't see how toxic our family dynamic was, then maybe we needed professional help. That's how we ended up in Dr. Rachel Simmons' office. I thought marriage counseling might help Vanessa understand the impact of her behavior, that a neutral third party could help us communicate better and find solutions. I was still operating under the assumption that Vanessa wanted to fix things, that she cared about Ethan and our family. The first session was individual intakes where Dr. Simmons met with each of us separately. She asked me about my marriage and my relationship with Ethan and what I hoped to gain from therapy. I told her the truth, that my wife had been emotionally abusing my son and I needed help figuring out how to protect him while saving my marriage. Dr. Simmons took notes and asked careful questions about specific incidents. She asked if Ethan was in therapy. I said no. She strongly recommended finding him a counselor who specialized in adolescence and family trauma. I promised I would. When Vanessa's individual session ended and we reconvened for our first joint session, Dr. Simmons asked Vanessa what she hoped to achieve. That's when Vanessa said it. Said Ethan was the reason she wanted a divorce. Said she couldn't stay in a marriage where she'd always come second to my son. Dr. Simmons asked Vanessa to elaborate. Vanessa said she'd tried to be a good stepmother, but Ethan had rejected every attempt. That I enabled his disrespect by never holding him accountable. That she'd sacrificed her independence and her apartment and her freedom to be part of our family, and all she got in return was hostility and resentment. She said she'd spent 3 years competing with a dead woman's memory and a teenage boy's manipulation, and she was done. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Dr. Simmons asked Vanessa if she'd be willing to work on the marriage if Ethan lived elsewhere. Vanessa said yes immediately. Said that with some distance, maybe they could rebuild their relationship on healthier terms. That Ethan was almost 18 anyway, and would be leaving for college soon. That this could be an opportunity for him to develop independence. Dr. Simmons turned to me and asked how I felt about that suggestion. The words stuck in my throat. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. My wife was sitting in a therapist's office calmly explaining why my son needed to be removed from his own home. Dr. Simmons was asking me to consider it like it was a reasonable option. I said no. Just no. Ethan wasn't going anywhere. Dr. Simmons asked if I was willing to consider any compromise. I said not, if the compromise involved my son feeling unwanted or abandoned. Vanessa said that was exactly the problem, that I would always choose Ethan over her, over our marriage, over my own happiness. I looked at her and said she was absolutely right, that I would choose my son every single time, that if she needed me to choose between them, she'd already lost. Vanessa stood up and walked out of the session. Dr. Simmons and I sat in that beige room with the humming white noise machine, and she asked me if I understood my marriage was over. I said yes. She asked if I had a lawyer. I said not yet. She handed me a business card for a family law attorney named Thomas Griffith. She said I should call him immediately. I called Thomas Griffith from my car in the parking lot outside Dr. Simmons' office. His receptionist said he had an opening the next afternoon. I took it. I drove home in a fog, trying to process the fact that my marriage had just ended in a therapy session I'd initiated to save it. When I got home, Ethan was in the kitchen making a sandwich. He looked up when I walked in and asked how counseling went. I told him it was complicated. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. I asked him if we could talk. He said sure, and followed me into the living room. We sat on the couch and I tried to figure out how to explain that I was getting divorced because my wife wanted him gone. I started by apologizing. I told him I knew Vanessa had been treating him badly, that I should have noticed sooner and protected him better, that I'd failed him by prioritizing my marriage over his well-being. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He said it wasn't my fault, that Vanessa was good at hiding things when I was around. I told him it was absolutely my fault, that I was his father and I should have created an environment where he felt safe telling me the truth. I told him Vanessa had said in therapy that she wanted me to choose between her and him. Ethan's face went pale. He asked what I'd said. I told him I chose him, that I would always choose him, that nothing and no one would ever be more important to me than his safety and happiness. Ethan started crying for real then, not quiet tears, but deep sobs that shook his whole body. I pulled him into a hug and held him while he cried. When he finally pulled back, he asked if I was really getting divorced because of him. I told him I was getting divorced because Vanessa had shown her true character, and I couldn't stay married to someone who would hurt my son. That this was about her choices, not his existence. He nodded, but I could see he didn't fully believe me. Years of Vanessa's poisoning had done damage that wouldn't be undone with one conversation. Thomas Griffith's office was in a high-rise downtown with glass walls and modern furniture. He was maybe 55 with silver hair and an air of controlled competence. I met with him on Monday afternoon and laid out the entire situation, the emotional abuse, the campaign to force Ethan out, the therapy session where Vanessa demanded I choose. Thomas listened and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he asked if I had documentation. I showed him my notebook. He photographed every page with his phone. He asked if I had any recordings. I said no. He asked if there were witnesses to Vanessa's treatment of Ethan. I mentioned Patricia and gave him her contact information. Thomas said he'd need to interview her. He explained the divorce process in Colorado and what to expect. He said given that we'd only been married 3 years and I'd entered the marriage with significant assets, including the house, the settlement should be straightforward. He warned me that Vanessa would likely try to claim emotional distress or demand spousal support. He said her statement in therapy that Ethan was the reason for the divorce could actually work in our favor if she tried to claim the marriage failed due to my behavior. Thomas said he'd prepare divorce papers and have them ready for my review by the end of the week. I signed a retainer agreement and wrote him a check for $5,000. Walking out of his office, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I was finally taking action to protect Ethan. Dread about what Vanessa would do when she realized I was serious. I needed to tell Ethan's school what was happening. The black eye incident had been 3 weeks ago, and I knew Mr. Ian Carter, the school counselor, had been monitoring Ethan since then. I called and asked for a meeting. Mr. Carter had worked at the high school for 9 years and had a reputation for genuinely caring about the students. We met in his office on a Wednesday morning before classes started. The room was cramped but comfortable with student artwork on the walls and a worn couch against one side. I told Mr. Carter about the situation at home, the emotional abuse, the impending divorce, the therapy session. Mr. Carter listened with a grave expression. He said he'd noticed changes in Ethan over the past year, that his grades had slipped from a 3.9 GPA to a 3.2, that he'd become more withdrawn in class, that the fight had been completely out of character for a kid who'd never had behavioral issues before. Mr. Carter said he wished someone had reported concerns sooner. I said I wished I'd seen them sooner. Mr. Carter asked if Ethan was in therapy. I said not yet, but I was working on it. He gave me names of 3 therapists who specialized in adolescence and family trauma. He said the school could provide additional support through their counseling program if Ethan wanted it. He also said he'd make a note in Ethan's file about the family situation so his teachers would be aware and could offer flexibility if needed. I thanked him and asked him to keep an eye on Ethan. Mr. Carter promised he would. I served Vanessa with divorce papers on a Friday evening. Thomas had recommended serving her at home to avoid workplace embarrassment, though part of me wanted her to feel the same humiliation she'd inflicted on Ethan. The process server arrived at 6:30. Vanessa answered the door and accepted the envelope. I was upstairs with Ethan, both of us pretending to be occupied with other things while we listened to the exchange. The process server left. Vanessa came upstairs and found me in the bedroom. She was holding the papers with shaking hands. She asked if I was serious. I said yes. She said I was making a mistake, that we could work through this if I just gave her a chance. I reminded her that she'd told a therapist she wanted a divorce unless I sent my son away. Vanessa said she'd been emotional and hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I told her I'd heard her say similar things multiple times over 3 years, that I'd documented pattern after pattern of emotional abuse, that I had witnesses. Vanessa's expression changed from pleading to cold. She said I'd regret this, that she'd fight me on every single asset, that she'd make sure everyone knew I'd chosen my bratty teenage son over my wife. I told her to do whatever she felt necessary, but she needed to find somewhere else to live. Vanessa laughed bitterly. She said the house was marital property, and she had as much right to be here as I did. I told her my lawyer disagreed, that the house had been mine before the marriage and was protected under Colorado law. Vanessa said she'd contest that. I said she was welcome to try. She packed a bag and left that night, saying she'd stay with a friend. Ethan and I stood in the hallway after she left, listening to the sound of her car fading into the distance. Ethan asked if it was really over. I told him yes. He nodded slowly and went back to his room. The next week, Vanessa's lawyer sent Thomas a letter demanding $50,000 in cash as compensation for emotional distress caused by the dissolution of the marriage. The letter claimed Vanessa had given up her career opportunities and apartment to support our family, only to be discarded when she tried to establish healthy boundaries with a troubled teenager. Thomas called me laughing. He said Vanessa's attorney, a woman named Barbara Green, was either incompetent or desperate, that claiming emotional distress while simultaneously admitting to trying to establish boundaries that involved removing a minor from his home was legal suicide. Thomas drafted a response outlining Vanessa's documented abuse of Ethan, her statement in therapy demanding he leave, and witness testimony from Patricia and Mr. Carter. He offered Vanessa $10,000 to walk away quietly and sign a non-disparagement agreement. Barbara sent back a counteroffer of $35,000. Thomas rejected it. The negotiations dragged on for weeks. Meanwhile, Vanessa started contacting my friends and family with her version of events. She called my sister Julia and told her I'd become unreasonably possessive of Ethan and couldn't handle the idea of sharing parental authority. She called Claire's parents and said I was using their grandson to avoid dealing with my grief over their daughter. She posted vague messages on social media about the challenges of step-family life and the pain of loving someone who couldn't commit fully. Each post generated dozens of sympathetic comments from people who had no idea what she'd actually done. Julia called me after talking to Vanessa. She asked if I knew my wife was telling people I'd become controlling and paranoid. I said I knew. Julia asked if any of it was true. I told her what had really happened. The abuse, the ultimatum, the documentation. Julia went quiet. Then she said she'd never liked Vanessa, but had kept it to herself because I seemed happy. I asked why she hadn't said anything. Julia said she'd tried to hint a few times, but I'd been defensive, that I'd seemed so determined to make the marriage work that she didn't think I'd listen. She was probably right. I'd been so invested in the idea of moving forward and building a new life that I'd ignored warning signs from people who cared about me. Julia asked how Ethan was doing. I said he was seeing a therapist and seemed relieved that Vanessa was gone, but he was still carrying guilt about the divorce. Julia asked if she could talk to him. I said I'd ask him. That night I mentioned to Ethan that Julia wanted to check in with him. He said okay. They talked for over an hour while I sat downstairs trying to give them privacy. When Ethan came down after the call, he looked lighter somehow. He said Julia had told him that Vanessa's behavior wasn't his fault and that sometimes adults made bad choices that had nothing to do with the kids in their lives. I asked if that helped. He said a little. Claire's parents, Richard and Susan, were less understanding. They showed up at the house on a Saturday morning without calling first. Richard was stern-faced and serious. Susan looked worried. I invited them in and made coffee while they sat in the living room. Richard got straight to the point. He said Vanessa had called them claiming I was making life decisions based on Ethan's manipulation, that I couldn't see how Ethan was using his mother's death to control my relationships. Susan added that she was concerned I wasn't ready to move on from Claire and was sabotaging my marriage because of unresolved grief. I sat there listening to my dead wife's parents repeat my current wife's lies, and I felt something crack in my chest. I asked them if they really believed Ethan would manipulate me. Richard said teenagers did manipulative things, especially when they felt threatened by changes in their family structure. I pulled out my phone and showed them my documentation. Every incident, every cruel comment, every deliberate exclusion. I showed them the notes from Dr. Simmons's session where Vanessa had demanded Ethan leave. I played them a voicemail Vanessa had left me 2 days ago, screaming about how I was ruining her life by refusing to settle. Richard's face changed as he read. Susan started crying. When they finished looking at everything, Richard said he owed me an apology. Susan said she couldn't believe Vanessa had fooled them so completely. I told them Vanessa had fooled me too for 3 years, that she was good at presenting exactly the face people wanted to see. Susan asked how Ethan was handling everything. I told them honestly, that he was in therapy, that he was dealing with guilt and anger and confusion, that he was 17 and shouldn't have to process his stepmother's emotional abuse. Susan asked if they could talk to him. I called Ethan downstairs. When he saw his grandparents, his face went guarded. Richard stood up and walked over to Ethan. He pulled him into a hug and said he was sorry for believing lies about him. Ethan started crying. Susan joined the hug. The three of them stood there in my living room crying while I watched from the doorway. Eventually they separated and sat down together. Richard asked Ethan to tell them what the past 3 years had really been like. Ethan did. He told them everything Vanessa had said and done, how she'd made him feel unwelcome, how she'd told him repeatedly that he was a burden, how he'd planned to leave for college on the East Coast just to make things easier for me. By the time he finished, Susan was crying again. Richard looked like he wanted to find Vanessa and have a few choice words with her. They stayed for lunch and spent the afternoon with us, and by the time they left, I felt like we'd rebuild something that Vanessa's lies had almost destroyed. The divorce finalized 4 months after I filed. Vanessa eventually accepted $15,000 and signed away any claim to the house or any other assets. She also signed a non-disparagement agreement and an agreement never to contact Ethan without his explicit consent. Thomas said she'd folded because Barbara had finally convinced her that going to court would result in a public airing of her abuse and likely leave her with nothing. On the day the judge signed the final decree, I felt relief so profound, it was almost physical. I picked Ethan up from school and told him it was done. He asked if that meant Vanessa was really out of our lives. I said yes. He was quiet for the rest of the drive home. That night at dinner, just the two of us at the kitchen table like old times, Ethan asked if I regretted marrying her. I told him the truth, that I regretted the pain she'd caused him, but I didn't regret learning who she really was before wasting more years, that some mistakes were necessary to get to the right place. Ethan nodded and said he hoped I'd eventually find someone who actually cared about both of us. I told him I wasn't worried about that right now, that rebuilding our relationship and making sure he was okay was my only priority. 2 years later, Ethan graduated high school with honors. He'd pulled his GPA back up to a 3.8. He'd been accepted to University of Colorado Boulder, 30 minutes from our house, where he planned to study psychology. At his graduation, I sat with Julia and Richard and Susan and Patricia and Leo's whole family. We cheered when his name was called. That night, we had a party at the house with too much food and too many people. Ethan gave a speech thanking everyone who'd supported him, and when he got to me, he said the most important thing he'd learned in high school was that family wasn't about blood or marriage certificates. It was about who showed up and chose you when it mattered. He said I'd chosen him when it counted most, and that meant everything. I couldn't speak through the lump in my throat. Later, after everyone left and we were cleaning up, Ethan asked if I ever heard from Vanessa. I said no. He nodded and said good. That chapter was closed, and we were better for it. Standing in our kitchen surrounded by the debris of celebration, I knew he was right. We'd survived. We'd rebuilt. We were exactly where we needed to be. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.